I've got in mind for this evening is I've got a talk to start with, and then we'll get into some groups, and then we'll finish with a metabhavana meditation. So so let's get underway then. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. So we've been looking at the 5 spiritual faculties. That's our overarching theme for the present. So starting off in the middle there with smrti, or mindfulness. And then on one axis, virya, or vigor, or energy in pursuit of the good. And then balancing that, samadhi, or concentration. On the other axis, we have shraddha, or faith. And at the other end of that axis, we have prajna, or wisdom. And it's shraddha that we're going to be looking at this evening. So as you know, we've been looking at the 5 spiritual faculties, but also in looking at the 5 spiritual faculties and the 20 suggestions for working with overwhelm, and looking at the 20 suggestions for working with overwhelm in the light of the 5 spiritual faculties. And so tonight it's in the light of shraddha, that's faith. So I have to say, when we came to dividing up these evenings, when we were allocating out the evenings between the team, I didn't naturally gravitate towards shraddha. I don't strongly consider myself to be a faith type, whatever that is. So shraddha wasn't the evening that I would choose, which is why I chose it. It was an opportunity to think more about it, to explore it, to engage with it, to challenge myself with it. So here I am, I've got the shraddha evening. But then what is faith in Buddhism? That's what we need to perhaps look at first of all. I'm old enough to have done my mitra study when we had, back in the old days, when we had audio tapes. And so mitra study was largely Sangharakshita's talks on audio tape. And often Sangharakshita would suggest that we should define our terms. He was very keen on defining our terms. Before we went anywhere, we need to define what it is that we were talking about, which is a very good thing to do. So, for example, if you're asking the question, is Buddhism a religion? You would have to, before you could answer that question, you would have to define, well, what do you mean by religion? You can't say whether it is or is not a religion unless you know what a religion is. So what do we mean by a faith type? What do we mean by being faithful? Well, this is one of the reasons why we use these strange Sanskrit terms often in Buddhism, not least with the 5 spiritual faculties. So we use it to try and avoid the risk of misunderstanding. We use the Sanskrit term, in this case, shraddha, because it has a more specific meaning in Buddhism. Whereas the English term, faith, could have quite a broad meaning. So it's open to misunderstanding. So for example, faith in Abrahamic religions, so Christianity, Islam, Judaism, includes a belief in the existence of God, in the reality of a transcendent domain that God administers as his kingdom, and in the benevolence of the will of God or God's plan for humankind. So that's faith in the Abrahamic religion. In particular, in Christianity, we could say that the precise understanding of the term faith differs among the various Christian traditions. Despite these differences, Christians generally agree that faith in Jesus lies at the core of the Christian tradition, and that such faith is required in order to be a Christian. Therefore, salvation in Christianity is attained through faith in Jesus. Faith in Islam could be said as Iman, which is the Arabic term for faith. Iman is that you believe in God and his angels and his books and his messengers and the hereafter and the good and evil fate ordained by God. And that's from the Hadith of Jibril, or Discourse of Gabriel. So these are quite specific tenets. When we talk about faith in some of these religions, they're really quite specific. Whereas faith, or let's say Shraddha in Buddhism, could be said to be something along these lines. In Buddhism, faith refers to a serene commitment to the practice of the Buddha's teaching and trust in enlightened or highly developed beings, such as Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. So I quite like that explanation of Shraddha, faith in Buddhism. I would argue that Shraddha in Buddhism cannot be belief in something that is not true, that is non-factual. That's to say, Shraddha cannot be in opposition to that which is established as being true. For example, the evolution of species. I have never heard a Buddhist argue that evolution of species cannot possibly be true because it contradicts Buddhist teachings. So I've never heard that. I would also argue that Shraddha cannot be based on that which would conflict with what is established as being true. So some sort of creator myth. I've never heard a Buddhist argue that the Big Bang cannot have happened because it contradicts Buddhist teachings. I have, however, heard lots and lots of debate about the nature and the fact, or otherwise, of rebirth. So I strongly believe that Shraddha, that faith in Buddhism, differs from what is understood by faith in some other belief systems. So using the word Shraddha avoids that potential confusion. But Shraddha is by no means just about facts. There is a strong emotional component as well. It is said that Shraddha arises when one sees an expression of the truth, that there is a resonance between that expression and the truth in oneself. There is a joy in seeing an expression of the truth, a great relief, it could be said. You may have some experience of that yourself when perhaps you first encountered the Dharma, or on some subsequent experience when you encountered some expression of the Dharma, of the Buddha's teaching, an excitement. So there's a very strong emotional component. As it says in the Pali text, magnificent Lord, magnificent, just as if he were to place upright what was overturned, to reveal what was hidden, to show the way to one who was lost, or to carry a lamp into the dark, so that those with eyes could see forms. In the same way has the Blessed One, through many lines of reasoning, made the Dharma clear. So there's this emotional element when we hear the truth, even though the truth is based on reasoning, as in when the Buddha was explaining it. We covered this in our preparation for ordination retreat once, when I was studying with Padmavajra at Dharmaloka. And he was saying, well, what, these expressions that he used, as if it were to place upright that which was overturned. What sort of modern expressions could you use? And somebody came up with the idea, oh Lord, it is as if the Lord has turned up the colour on a black and white TV. Or, oh Lord, it is as if I'm being served a cup of finest Costa Rican coffee after a lifetime of making do with Mellow Bird's Instant. So we could update this, but you get the idea. There's a strong, it's not just all about the mind and facts. There's a strong emotional element to it, but it's underpinned as well by reasonableness. Shraddha is also said to be an intuitive response, which I agree with. I think this is true, but we have to be a little careful here. If we don't have a well-developed sense of intuition, we can be led astray. We can mistake an intuitive response for our own desire. After all, some people do bizarre and even terrible things in the name of faith. So it's important to reflect upon Shraddha, on our Shraddha, and to clarify our thinking. Meditation is, of course, important here in bringing clarity to our minds, to sift through our subtle desires, to see our intuitive responses clearly. So let's now look at some of Vessantara's suggestions for dealing with overwhelm in the light of Shraddha. So I've selected some of those suggestions, some of the 20 suggestions that I think particularly relate to Shraddha. So in number 7, we have hold in your heart the wish for suffering to come to an end. Hold in your heart the wish for suffering to come to an end. So this is not a physical action as such. And I tend to be a solution seeker. So if there's an issue of some sort, I look for a solution. And this can be very useful. It can avoid procrastination and indecision, but it's not always the most helpful response. Sometimes, after all, there is no obvious solution. And in those cases, when I can't find a solution, I can get despondent or frustrated. So we have to remember, after all, that fundamentally samsara is broken and none of us can change that. We all have to live with the marks of conditioned existence. Sometimes the best response, especially when there is no obvious solution, is simply to wish for suffering to end. Now I find that this needs Shraddha, to work towards something that cannot be clearly seen, for which there is no obvious solution, and that you don't know how a solution may come about. You need to have Shraddha that a solution may emerge. Or perhaps a solution will not emerge, but life will go on. But this suggestion is not about doing anything as such. It's about holding a wish in your heart and having Shraddha that this wish can transform us and perhaps others, and over time may help show us the way. And perhaps if enough people hold this wish in their heart, it may indeed affect a change. So number 8 is let your heart break. Let your heart break. Sometimes our response to suffering can seem overwhelming. It feels like our heart might indeed break. So what should we do? Or what are we to do? And Vessantara's suggestion is that we be prepared to let our heart open. Your heart cannot be broken by compassion. Everything is impermanent. So allow a wave of sadness to be transformed. Clearly, this requires Shraddha. Emotions can be scary and can be unpleasant, but they are just emotions. They are, as we'll come to see later, empty of any inherent existence. We can acknowledge our emotions, allow ourselves to feel the emotions without rushing off to do something to make it change. We can acknowledge that we feel this way because we care. Number 9, work in your sphere of influence. I was reading a book the other day about this time traveler who accidentally went back to 1348, which was unfortunate because that was when the Black Death came to Britain. So it was a bad choice. Now, I know, as probably, we all know, that between a third and a half of the population of Europe died from the Black Death. And it was also a horrible way to die. But this book I was reading, introduced me to a small group of individuals that the time traveler, as the time traveler tried to figure out where she was, what year she was in, and how to avoid giving the impression that she was a witch, which would have been bad, obviously. And so we learned, as she did this over the days and weeks, we learned about this family that she was living with and their servants and stuff. So we got to know them. And then when these individuals began to get ill with the plague, and then they were suffering terribly and then dying, it was really upsetting to read. I found it really difficult, especially with the children. It was quite emotional. But what I thought was interesting, that reading about a handful of fictional characters dying in this way actually had more of an emotional effect on me than the rather abstract knowledge that millions of people died from the plague. So this specific and particular and personal example had much more effect than the wider fact of the millions of deaths. Well, what's that got to do with working in your sphere of influence, you might be thinking? Well, I think a source of anxiety or suffering for us is often the gap between our sphere of influence and our sphere of awareness. This is one difference to the time of the Buddha. The suffering of the world is placed daily before our eyes. It's a big world with a lot of people, and there will always be, and always has been, intense suffering every minute of every day somewhere. We don't need for it all to be shown to us vividly, because of course that is what the media tend to do. They want to have an impact on us, as Suryodaya touched on in her talk a couple of weeks ago. So they don't just tell us that loads of people died today in an earthquake somewhere in the world. They don't do that. Instead, they tend to show us a film of the suffering of, say, one little girl and her family, because this plays on our heartstrings. This has a big emotional impact, like my time traveling book. This is how the modern media works. They want to make an emotional impact on us, naturally. But this can be painful, difficult, and often there's very little that we can actually do about it. So we need to be wary of this, as our sphere of influence is, of course, limited. We need to have Shraddha, that we do what we can do, and that's good enough. Number 10, empathize with the perpetrators as well as the victims. Empathize with the perpetrators as well as the victim. So Vessantara says here that this means recognizing how they, the perpetrators, are being driven by suffering as well. In a way, what we see is just a cloud of suffering caused by nobody understanding how things are. So when we've caused suffering, while we may express regret and we may apologize, I think it's also true that we would also like people to empathize with us, to understand what it was that led us to behave in that unskillful way. We're looking for some sort of understanding. We are all victims of samsara. Are the perpetrators happy? Generally, I don't think so. On the contrary, they may be suffering greatly themselves, or at least very deluded. And they will usually end up in an undesirable situation, prison, reviled, or dead. Forgiveness, of course, can be difficult, especially when people do not express regret. But even so, we can empathize with perpetrators' suffering that led them to act in such extreme ways. Number 12, entrust the situation to deeper forces. Entrust the situation to deeper forces. So remember what I said near the start there. In Buddhism, faith refers to a serene commitment to the practice of the Buddha's teaching and trust in enlightened or highly developed beings such as Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. So we know that a Buddha is an enlightened being. We know that a Bodhisattva is a being that has approached the point of enlightenment and has deferred ultimate nirvana in order to be reborn back into samsara on this world or other worlds to try and help other living beings. And we can open ourselves to the power of the Bodhisattvas. Let the Bodhisattvas impact us. Whatever the Bodhisattvas are. There is a tradition in some elements of Buddhism of other power, whereby it's thought that attaining enlightenment is extremely difficult, perhaps even impossible by one's own will. And so the way to do it is to appeal to other power. That's the power of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, for their help to get you across the finishing line. And it's not big in our movement, although it does crop up in our movement from time to time. It's certainly true that being open to the influence of the Bodhisattvas, whatever they may be, can take us beyond ourselves, beyond what we might otherwise limit ourselves to be, which is why we have images of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, why we might meditate upon the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, because they can draw us onward, take us beyond ourselves, whatever ourselves might be. And for me, I've always thought that exploring the nature of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, these mythical figures, and my relation with them, is a way of describing my practice. So we can have Sraddha in the Bodhisattvas. As it says in the Sevenfold Puja, I rejoice in the nature of the Bodhisattva. So rejoice. We don't have to do everything ourselves. There are deeper forces, even if we don't know exactly what they are. Number 15, use the wish. Sorry, I'll start again. Number 15, use the wishing prayer that dispels hope and fear. Use the wishing prayer that dispels hope and fear. So Vessantara tells us that in the Tibetan Lojong mind training tradition, they recommend that when we're full of hopes and fears about how a situation will turn out, we make the wish that whatever is for the best, may it happen. This, to me, seems always appropriate. It allows us to let go of worry about the outcome. In actual fact, we don't always know anyway what the best outcome may be. We do our best and hope for the best. This approach can make complicated, mind-befuddling situations suddenly very straightforward, just wishing for the best. But it necessitates Shraddha and a recognition that we are not the center of the universe. In letting go of worry about an outcome, we let go of ego grasping. The world doesn't need our help. I'm sorry, I'll say that again. The world doesn't need our worry in order to turn out for the best. Number 16. Equanimity comes from reflecting that everyone has their own karma. Equanimity comes from reflecting that everyone has their own karma. So we probably have some experience of trying to help someone, but not getting the response we would like. It's as if the individual doesn't want to help themselves, which can be incredibly frustrating. Clearly, though, that's not how the other person sees it. But we learn that people have to be ready to receive help, need to be in the right place, the right conditions must be present. This can be seen as their karma. When the time is right, they may seek the help they need. Maybe we ourselves have been the other person in such a situation. I clearly remember a time like that for myself before I became a Buddhist, when I used to, well, what it was, I got sent on this, I used to work for IBM, you know, the computer company, and I got sent on this course, and it was weird because for some reason they sent us on this course where we were doing things like the I Ching and looking at the shadow and Native American myth and so on. I don't know why IBM sent us on this course. It must have been some kind of clerical error or something, but it was the best course I ever went on at IBM, called Fit for the Future. And anyway, we did the I Ching. And at the time, I smoked a lot of cannabis on a regular basis and had done for years. And it just become quite a habit, but it wasn't a habit I felt able to give up in some reason. So I did the I Ching and I asked what I should do about moving forward, because I was feeling kind of, I don't know, like I wasn't getting anywhere. And anyway, so I did the I Ching, and the I Ching came back and it said blocked. And immediately I thought, this is referring to the fact that I'm smoking cannabis and it's preventing me moving on. It's a blockage. But I wasn't able to do anything about it there. I accepted the truth of it, but I also felt that I couldn't do anything about it. And it wasn't until 2 years later that I was able to give up cannabis and move forward, thanks to severe depression and anxiety. But anyway, so the point was, I was at a place where I couldn't move on. I was just stuck. And the situation, the circumstances had to change before I could. But it's generally true, I think. Everybody has their own karma. So it's easy to blame or to criticize others, but each person is doing what they see as best at the time, according to their own point of view and their own circumstances. When you see a politician on TV espousing a point of view with which you perhaps strongly disagree, it's easy to feel dislike, even hatred towards that person. But that person actually might be quite nice and kind, really. We don't know. All we know is that at this point in time, they have a different point of view about something. And points of view change all the time. Dislike and hatred do not help and are unpleasant to experience. So, of course, by all means disagree, but try to remain equanimous. Equanimity is such a desirable quality, isn't it? And such a wonderful practice. Think how happy we could be with equanimity. But do we have enough Shraddha to let go of our disapproval? Okay, number 18, use short pieces of Dharma to help anchor you. So we've all got our favorite pieces of Dharma that particularly resonate with us. Things to which we have an emotional response, usually, pieces in which we have Shraddha, and we know the value of bearing these in mind. So by all means, make a practice of noting down such nuggets of these kind. Write them down. Commit them to memory. That's a good practice. Bring them to mind frequently, especially during difficult circumstances. Some of you might have them tattooed onto your bodies. I'm not necessarily advocating that, by the way. And they might not necessarily be explicitly Buddhist. I remember talking, again, this was on a preparation for ordination retreat at Padmaloka. This time I was talking to Suratta about fear and dealing with fear. And he was saying how he went through a stage of he had this, fear, and he wanted to deal with that. And one thing he brought to mind was the litany against fear from the science fiction novel Dune, which was a book I knew very well. I think it's possibly the greatest science fiction book written, and I knew the litany against fear, and I thought, what a fantastic idea. So I'll just recite it for you now, so you might know it yourself. So in the event of fear, I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. And finally, number 20, the ultimate solution to overwhelm is awareness of emptiness. Emptiness, the awareness of emptiness. So shunyata, emptiness or voidness, is the teaching that all things have no intrinsic nature of their own. All conditioned things are to be contemplated as if they were a bubble or a shadow, like dew, or a flash of lightning. As it says in the Heart Sutra, all things are by nature void. That is to say, they are transient, ephemeral, ungraspable. This applies to ourselves, other things, other people, our emotions, our suffering, life itself. Though things actually exist and have properties, our world, our personal world, is determined by our perceptions and our responses. Shunyata doesn't mean disassociating from our suffering or our emotions and feelings. Rather, seeing them more and more as they actually are, empty of any intrinsic nature. Ultimately, there really is nothing to worry about. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have some prompts now, following on from that talk.